Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. You are here for the Opportunity to Learn campaign webinar with the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. We're very glad that you could join us today. Before I hand things over to our moderator, Ann Beaudry, I'm just going to walk you through how to ask us questions, because I'm sure you'll probably have a lot of questions on this webinar, and we're happy to hear from you and happy to answer your questions. On the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a chat box. Just type in your question in the chat box, make sure that you are sending to the host, and hit enter, and we will be able to see your questions and answer your questions as we're going along. We'll have some breaks worked into the webinar specifically to answer your questions, so just let us know. Ann, would you like to take it away?
Great. Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you to everybody who's joined our call today. We've got three major things we want to really pack into this quite full hour. And the first one on this whole issue of raising revenue is to introduce you really to all of the resources that are on the OTL website. There is a microsite with a fabulous report with strategies and resources that can help you as you wage these campaigns in your state. The second thing is to introduce you to some on-the-ground resources, which are the sort of budget and policy center organizations that belong either to the EARN network, which is the Economic Analysis Research Network, or SFAI, as it's called, the State Fiscal Analysis Initiative, organizations in 40 different states who are terrific partners as you put together coalitions and wage these battles. And then thirdly, after we've taken you through some of these resources, we want to introduce you to have two wonderful panelists on today's call who are going to be able to tell you about their experience in waging these campaigns. So we're going to go from the website resources to the really sort of on the ground, this is what it looks like when it's running. And the next slide, one of the reasons the sort of question, next slide, in terms of talking about revenue, is that this is particularly important now. Ever since the 2008 recession, you know, most states have seen really sharpest budget cuts in their education funding. In more than a dozen states, those declines are greater than 10%. And we all know what that means in terms of particularly our most vulnerable students. And that next slide. And some people ask, you know, why are we focusing, you know, why can't we just use existing revenues for this? Why do we need new revenue? And the answer is that there's already such a large percentage of state budgets that are devoted to K through 12 education. It's really not possible to make substantial increases if we stay within the current tax and budget framework simply by shifting resources from other priorities. And as you can see, those shifts, if they were made, would require deep cuts in other programs, many of which are already dedicated to the essential well-being of families and children. We obviously don't think that's true about the corrections 5% budget, but that's another conversation. So raising state-level education funding, you know, by a third would really mean such cuts to those programs, and it's not a possible thing. The next slide, Josh. And the main focus here that we wanted to do, the next slide after that, in terms of focusing on, you know, state revenue, next slide, is that, excuse me, nationwide, a very large share of public education K through 12 funding is already coming from state governments. And the essential thing here is that we're going to have to look to state revenues in order to provide adequate school funding. And fairness is another major reason that we're focusing on state-level revenue sources in the different strategies we're going to go through in this webinar. Collecting revenue at the state level and then distributing it, very importantly, by a fair formula to school districts is the major strategy to help level the playing field among the different communities, because asking local communities to shoulder more of the cost, given that there's such disparity in terms of their property tax base, et cetera, is really not as possible to get both sufficient amounts of revenue and from a progressive taxation source as if we're looking at the state level. So I wanted to introduce Kurt Wise next, who is with the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, to walk us through, as we were talking about, the resources in the report and on the OTL website to talk about how to generate specific state-level revenue. Kurt?
Great. Thank you, Anne. Let's just begin by jumping right in and going to our Investing in the Future website. You can see that landing page here. You can get to that landing page through the OTL larger website. On the left-hand column of the OTL homepage, there's a box that you can click on. There's some other ways right on that OTL main web page that you can click through to get to the Investing in the Future website. But this is what the homepage looks like. Again, last week we talked about a number of important things, including general discussion of taxes, economic issues, and some of the communications and messaging information. And you can find all of that, if you want to review it, on the background basics section. We encourage folks to go back and review that material. It's very important and helpful for anyone working to raise new revenue. But in today's webinar, we want to introduce people to a few of the policy solutions described on the website so that people can get a little more familiar with the kind of information that's available on the site, help people know that raising revenue is possible. It's been done in states across the country, and it can be done in your state as well. So let's start by clicking through to the Policy Solutions landing page. Here on the Policy Solutions homepage, you can see the 9 categories of policy options, and you can see that those are each in their own box there down below. Each category looks at a single distinct set of revenue-raising options. I want to remind people that every option on the site meets 3 basic criteria. It's capable of raising meaningful amounts of new revenue. It's progressive in its net effect and within the bounds of political feasibility. So that describes each and every one of the options that we review on the site. But let's turn initially to the most basic option, for raising progressive revenue, adopting an across-the-board increase to the tax rate or rates applied to personal income. There's an appealing simplicity to this approach. It's easy to explain to voters and to legislators, and it can raise substantial revenue in a progressive way with making only relatively modest increases in the rates. In most cases, again, the effect would be quite progressive. But let's look again at that question of progressivity by looking at a couple of charts. So the next 2 charts will both follow the format of these axes here. To the left, the vertical axis shows the share of a family's income collected in taxes, and then along the horizontal axis at the bottom, the charts show families grouped by income. Low-income families are to the left, and high-income families are to the right. So now let's take a look at overall state and local taxes. So not federal taxes, those aren't included in here, but state and local taxes. And what we can see here is that these combined state and local taxes in the U.S. are regressive. Low-income families pay almost twice as large a share of their family income in state and local taxes as high-income families do. The personal income tax, however, the one that we're talking about now, the one we're focusing on now, one of the major elements of most state and local tax systems is different. So let's take a look at that one. For the personal income tax, you can see the pattern's quite different here. Low-income families pay only a small share of their household income, while upper-income households pay much more. It's worth noting that while this chart shows the overall average of all the states, the degree of progressivity can vary significantly from state to state. But given that overall typically is quite progressive, the personal income tax in many states, when we use this tax to raise more revenue, we both increase the resources available for things like K-12 education, and we do so in a way that improves the overall fairness of the state and local tax system. And that's the combination that we're looking for here. So with that information in mind, let's return again to the landing page for this revenue option. And here, users can read that 41 different states have a broad-based income tax, and they can learn about some of the differences among these state tax structures. And in our next slide, we'll see a map of those 41 states. Readers can also learn on the OTL webpage that raising existing tax rates across the board on personal income by just 10% would generate hundreds of millions of new tax dollars annually in most states, and in several states would generate additional billions annually. And to be clear, that means that, for example, if a state had a flat rate of 5%, the rate would rise to 5.5%. That's a 10% increase. So returning to the income tax landing page and scrolling down, we're not live on the website, but you would scroll down on that landing page. You would get to details about how to make an across-the-board rate increase more progressive. And we can see here under the methods of implementation that this can be achieved by coupling the rate increase with an increase in the state's standard deduction and or its personal exemption. These are both elements of many state income tax structures, and they are especially beneficial to low and moderate income households. So readers can get more of the details on all of that when they go online. Alternatively, or additionally, progressivity can be further improved by coupling the across-the-board rate increase with an increase in the state's earned income tax credit. 25 states offer such a tax reduction program. You can see those highlighted here in green. And like the standard deduction and personal exemption, the EITC benefits low and moderate income households. So states that already have an EITC program can make those programs more generous, can make them stronger, and states without an EITC can generate or create such programs. Again, more of the details on all of this can be explored on the OTL website. This is probably a good time to remind people, again, that they can and should turn to their state's SFAI and EARN groups to help sort out which options will work best given the particulars of their state's tax laws and political climate. You can connect to those groups by visiting the Resources and Experts page on the OTL website. You can see that highlighted in the navigation bar at the top there. But now let's take a quick look at the next set of revenue options, millionaire's taxes. And if we click on that box, we arrive at the appropriate landing page on the OTL website. And here again, we get an introductory overview explaining what millionaire's taxes are and how they work. These taxes are specially designed to collect revenue exclusively from high-income households. Though called millionaire's taxes, often these taxes apply to income in excess of $250,000 or $500,000. So not millionaires per se, but definitely higher income households. In most states, these would be households in the top 5% or even top 1% of the income distribution. So as you can read on the website and see in this slide, some 36 states are well positioned in terms of their existing tax structures to implement a millionaire's tax. These are the states that are shown here in shades of purple and gray. These states already apply different tax rates to different levels of income. These different levels of income are called brackets, and this kind of a tax structure is called a graduated tax structure. This is how the federal income tax is structured. With higher tax rates applied to the upper income brackets, some states can generate $1 billion and more in new annual revenue, while states with lower incomes and lower population levels stand to gain tens of millions each. So returning to the OTL website, we can again see that there are various methods of implementation for creating a millionaire's tax. I won't go into many of the details here today. You can read about that more online. But two options for creating a millionaire's tax are to raise the tax rate on an existing high-income tax bracket or to create a new high-income tax bracket and apply a higher tax rate. Some 14 states already have an existing high-income bracket, a bracket that includes income, only income over $200,000 to $300,000 or higher. Some of these states already apply a meaningfully higher rate to this upper income, but other states do not. For those that do not yet do so, solution one that we just talked about, raising the rate on an existing bracket, may be a good option. There are another 22 states, however, with graduated structures that do not yet have an existing bracket that applies exclusively to upper incomes. So for these states, solution two may be the best option. It's worth noting here that a number of states have succeeded in recent years in instituting a millionaire's tax. These include New York, Connecticut, and California, as well as New Jersey and Maryland. And your state could be next. So yet again, we want to encourage folks to contact their SFAI and EARN groups to learn more about which of these options might work best in the context of their own state's tax laws and political climate. And if you click through to that resources page, you can see this is what it looks like, and you can then use the links on that page to look up what groups are active in your state. But returning now to our discussion of states that have already implemented a millionaire's tax, of course, such tax law changes are the product of intense and hard-fought revenue campaigns. And the people who have worked on these successful campaigns have many useful insights that they can share with the rest of us. And talked about that we would hear from some of those folks during the course of this webinar. We're going to do that. Before we do that, however, we're going to pause briefly to see if there are any questions about what we've already covered. Jocelyn, do we have any particular questions yet, or are we going to wait for the next break to field questions?
Just a reminder for folks, you can go ahead and use the chat box that should be on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Send us any questions or send them to the host. So far, there are no suggestions, so if you want to keep going, Kurt.
Great.
But feel free to send your questions in at any point.
Great. We're going to hear next from Stephen Bliss of the California Budget Project, or CBP. The CBP is one of the SFAI and EARN network groups, and the CBP is a fantastic resource for the folks in California. The CBP also played a role in the Prop 30 revenue campaign in California, which succeeded this last November in creating, among other things, a kind of a millionaire's tax. Stephen's going to tell us more about that recent campaign, but before we get to that, we're just going to take a quick look at two different ads that ran during the Prop 30 campaign, one in favor of Prop 30 and another against Prop 30. So let's check those out now. Great. Great. Well, with that as our lead-in, let's have Stephen join us. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Kurt, and thank you to Mass Budget and the OTL campaign and the Schott Foundation for the opportunity to be part of this webinar and also to talk a little bit about Prop 30 and what it meant for California, and particularly the campaign underlying Prop 30. What I'm going to do today is talk about what Prop 30 did, what the actual proposal was, and the impact it had on taxes and revenues in California, a little bit about sort of the key elements of the backdrop and the context for Prop 30, what the campaign actually looked like, and then some key lessons from the campaign. As Kurt mentioned, we are a policy research organization, and as such, our key role in Prop 30 was to serve as a resource for people that were trying to make sense of what Prop 30 was going to do, and also, of course, to the lead elements and lead organizations on the Prop 30 campaign. The one thing I want to emphasize, and if there's one takeaway from this presentation and the campaign, it's to underscore that the Prop 30 campaign really consisted of, in a sense, two parallel and distinct, although complementary campaigns. One sort of a top-level campaign that the governor was the lead on, and then a little bit more of a kind of grassroots and a little bit more of a community and regionally based campaign. And the two work together, of course, and as a policy research organization, the CBP was a resource for really both elements of the campaign. But the key takeaway here would be to understand that, particularly in a state as large as California, it really took both levels of that effort, and that in doing so, it involved actually carefully targeted messages targeting both of the key audiences that those groups were trying to reach. And I'll say more about that as we get into this. But just to quickly start out with what Proposition 30 did, it was approved by voters in November 2012, and it, to hark back to Kurt's presentation, this was sort of path one of the two paths that he talked about for obtaining higher income taxes on the wealthiest, in that it actually added new income tax rates for certain parts of California's income tax bracket. I should underscore that that it wasn't a millionaire's tax per se, although, as I'll say in a moment, it grew out of a millionaire's tax that was being pushed by a network of groups here in California. But ultimately, where Prop 30 landed, and I'll say more about this and talking about how the campaign unfolded, was really going even a little bit lower on the income tax, or on the income spectrum. So it was targeting people, individuals with incomes above $250,000 a year, and married taxpayers with incomes above $500,000 a year. It also included a slight increase in the state sales tax base rate from 7.25% to 7.5%. It's important to note that these the measures put in place by Prop 30 are temporary, and as you see here on this slide, the income tax rates will be in effect through 2018, and the sales tax increase will actually expire even 2 years sooner than that. A couple of notes about the backdrop for Prop 30. Like most states, like all states, California had huge revenue declines and deep spending cuts during the recession. What's a little bit less common, and was the case in California, is that our state requires a supermajority vote for the legislature to raise revenues. So it lends great importance to the ability to go to the ballot and go directly to voters to approve new tax increases, or to approve new tax rates. The other thing that was in the mix is that there was a high level of awareness of both the low level of funding for schools in California, especially compared to national levels, as well as the drop that they had seen during the recession, but also an awareness of the fact that the state's budget gap was real and was impacting people's lives in a day-to-day sense. And both of those are key because one of the things that we thought was important about Prop 30 is that it actually, by raising revenues, did both. It boosted general fund revenues for the state, and then in turn, given how K-12 funding and community college funding works in California, it also in turn boosted funding for K-12 schools and community colleges. And the fact that it did both of those was a real critical part of Prop 30, and something that we thought was particularly important. And then also, it was a progressive tax. It did target higher earners, higher income taxpayers in California, and it certainly benefited from the fact that there was a growing attention in California and nationally to the problem of widening income inequality. As to how the Prop 30 campaign or the Prop 30 proposal unfolded, the idea of putting tax increases before voters had actually been in the mix for a couple of years. Governor Brown had actually mentioned it during his campaign back in 2010, and mentioned that he would explore the prospect of taking to the voters via the statewide ballot some revenue measures. Also, there was, as I'll say a little bit more about, a Millionaires Tax Coalition that throughout late 2011 had really been pushing for and gearing up for putting on the ballot via signature gathering a millionaire's tax that would be permanent. So this was something that had been discussed and was certainly in the mix even prior to 2012. In 2012, when the governor rolled out his budget, his proposed budget, which was for 2012-13, when he rolled that out in early January of 2012, it included and assumed passage of the revenue measure by voters. And it held that if voters did not agree to the idea of boosting revenues, that there would be $6 billion in trigger cuts or automatic spending reductions that would take place in the 2012, in the next year. And these predominantly affected education. So the key thing there is that in the run-up to Prop 30, you already had additional revenues and the tax increases assumed by the governor's proposed budget, which, needless to say, lent a huge amount of importance to the push for voter approval of the new revenues. A key thing also was in mid-March of 2012, there was an agreement reached between the governor and the supporters of his revenue measure, and the coalition had been pushing for the millionaire's tax as early as late 2011. So they came together on the proposal that ultimately was the Prop 30 proposal that I showed a few slides ago. And the key thing there is that it did counter to the millionaire's tax proposal. The revenue measures were temporary, as I mentioned, and it also did include a sales tax increase, although the governor had initially proposed a ½ cent bump on the sales tax, and the compromise measure actually reduced the reliance on the sales tax to just a ¼ cent increase. So going into spring and summer of 2012, you had this joint campaign that brought together the Millionaire's Tax Coalition, the governor and his supporters and allies. And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, you get into this idea of this sort of parallel campaign that was in play. So on one hand, you had a major role played by the governor, by major unions in the state, and also by the political establishment, by which I mean the Democratic Party was deeply involved in pushing for Prop 30 in their outreach and voter engagement. They targeted, this part of the campaign targeted largely sort of the progressive base, so people that were expected to turn out and to support Prop 30, as well as swing voters, that is to say independent voters in California, who the campaign felt could be persuaded to approve the new revenues given the widespread understanding of need for increased school funding and addressing the state's budget gap. Parallel to that was the work of a group called Reclaim California's Future, which had grown out of the Millionaire's Tax Coalition, and that was much more of a grassroots outreach and social media and sort of on-the-streets effort that was trying to target not so much the existing base or swing voters, but really trying to reach groups that were part of the new California electorates. This was reaching out to young voters, people of color, and other new and occasional voters. So in terms of, and this had implications for different tactics and different messages between the two elements of this, what I'm calling this parallel campaign. So the governor and his allies and supporters largely worked through media buys. You saw one of the TV ads a moment ago, facilitated meetings with editorial boards to gain media support, op-eds that they helped partners place, messaging training, a speakers bureau, a number of local events with key messengers around education funding, and then also a get out the vote effort working largely through traditional networks such as the party infrastructure, key unions in the state and their organizing muscle. And the messaging was really focused, as you saw in part in that video we watched a moment ago, on the idea of stopping cuts to schools, which is a reference obviously to the trigger cuts in the governor's budget, targeting high-income earners, and also closing the budget deficit in California. The effort to Reclaim California's Future, which was groups like the Courage Campaign, California Calls, and the California Federation of Teachers, another of the major teachers unions in California, was much more focused on an aspirational message. They were much more on a message of trying to fund California's future and thinking about a little bit more focused on the inequality message and targeting the wealthiest Californians for the new revenues. And their tactics were heavily focused on social media and also working through a network of local organizations and regional organizations to reach more than 500,000 voters directly across the state. And they focused on phone banks, door-to-door canvassing, and like I said, working through these networks of organizations. Ultimately, just to put the revenues of Prop 30 in context, at the year it went through, it was about $6 billion in revenue, and that's on a state budget, general fund revenues for that year, that is to say 12-13, of about $96 billion. So it was a good chunk of revenue for the state and did serve to boost state revenues and in turn funding for schools. To quickly hit on some of the key lessons, the importance of building a broad coalition, as the Millionaire's Tax Coalition had done in 2011, and starting early in order to build the network and the capacity to do the statewide outreach. I talked about the importance that both sides of the campaign found in deploying messages strategically, so really thinking about who you're trying to reach and moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach to messaging to really carefully targeting your messages, starting where the public and the voters already are, and this is the extent to which the campaign really addressed the fact that people got that we needed to boost funding for our schools, and also that we really needed to close the state's budget gap. And then finally, of course, timing is a critical factor. The Prop 30 campaign was timed for a presidential election year, which the research going into the campaign showed would boost turnout among progressives and among members of the swing voter group that were thought to be potentially supportive of Prop 30. So timing was really key. Those are some of the main takeaways. I'm happy to talk further about some of the details or any other aspects of the Prop 30 campaign during the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. That's really useful information. Let's just pause for a moment and see if there are any questions. Jocelyn?
So we've got one question from Ann here, who's wondering that sometimes a lot of smaller grassroots groups don't necessarily have the funding or the resources to make big media buys like the ads that we saw at the beginning before Steve started talking. So Steve, do you have any, could you talk a bit about some of the on-the-ground grassroots work that was being done in California that kind of fed into the eventual campaign for Prop 30?
Sure. So that's a great question, and it's particularly one that the network of grassroots groups in California really had to take up, because given just the sheer size and population of California, to reach a sizable number of voters, you're really looking at do media buys in very large media markets, San Francisco, Sacramento in the Central Valley, Los Angeles. So you've hit upon a real key question, and there's two things I'll say to that. One is they did try to, and I think had some success at getting some sort of TV ad type messages out via social media. So they did have an active presence on YouTube, which allowed them to get similar and in many cases very professional looking video ads out into the state via YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and those types of mechanisms. And then also they did seek to place in one market, in the LA media market, one of the videos. So they had basically used a video which was really focused on kind of the whole budget impacts of Prop 30. In other words, not just school spending, but also spending on child care and health and other things that go into improving the lives of children, especially low-income children. They put together a video, put it out via social media, YouTube, and otherwise, and use that as a way to actually raise funds to then make the media buy in the LA media market, figuring that would be the biggest bang for their buck. So they kind of married the social media approach with the TV ad approach as a way of crowdsourcing, if you will, some of the funding for actually placing the ad. Beyond that, they put a heavy focus on a lot of the traditional, or I should say, sort of go-to social media strategies, such as sharing graphics online, trying to work through some of their partners out in, across many counties in California to help push out some of the messages and some of the key facts around what Prop 30 would mean for these various communities.
Great. Thank you very much.
We've got one more question for you, Steve, from Angela Brown. She's asking, who are the swing voters in California, and kind of which demographics were they from, and did they ultimately make a really big difference in getting Prop 30 passed?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it does tend to be, California is a very large independent voter base, so it does cut across actually a lot of different demographic groups, but I will say that it does tend to trend a little bit older and a little bit less diverse than California's demographics as a whole. And the Prop 30 campaign did ultimately, in addition to expanding the electorate and building a base of new voters, did succeed at getting the numbers they needed in attracting the swing voters. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that again, this awareness of the need to fix the budget, and a lot of people saying, look, that they're seeing the impact of the budget cuts in their own communities. And also, you really had a very aggressive push at the very end, and the Prop 30 ultimately passed by a pretty comfortable margin of about 10 points. But going into about 3 weeks before the election, it was still running below 50%. And the governor, in consort with, while the sort of grassroots work was going on, did this very aggressive sort of barnstorming tour of the state. And he, at the time, was very popular and continues to be to some extent among independent voters. And his push at the end helped bring some of the swing voters onto the Prop 30, the yes on 30 side.
Great. Well, I think in the interest of time, that we have other questions which we hope we can get to at the end or perhaps answer afterwards. We're going to move on with the webinar right now. So thank you very much, Stephen. It's really helpful, and it's definitely generated interest, obviously, among listeners. We're going to hear shortly about another successful revenue campaign. This one in Colorado a few years back and focused on changes to the state's business tax laws. In order to prepare ourselves just briefly for that discussion, let's take a quick look at a couple of the progressive revenue-raising options for business taxes that are listed on the site. So here we have the Policy Solutions homepage. We have two general categories on business tax options. The first focuses on reducing tax avoidance. The second on reducing or eliminating wasteful state-level tax breaks. Both options generate revenue overwhelmingly from large, profitable, multi-state and multinational corporations. And we're just going to look quickly at the first of those, business tax avoidance. So if we go to that landing page, we get an overview that explains that tax avoidance is actually a legal use of loopholes in tax laws. These loopholes usually are unintentional, but they're discovered and exploited by corporations. Closing these loopholes can bring in significant new revenue while also leveling the playing field for smaller in-state businesses. Again, it's worth taking a moment just to remember the underlying rationale for requiring businesses to pay taxes in the first place. Businesses are able to operate profitably only because of the many public services and structures provided by state and local governments, including things like police and fire, bridges and highways, court systems, an educated and healthy workforce, and on and on and on. It's also worth remembering that corporations are not overtaxed, certainly not by the standards of only a few decades ago. Instead, the share of state and local taxes paid by corporations has fallen markedly over the last 30 years, and you can see that here, that they've the share of all state and local taxes paid by corporations has been cut almost in half during the course of the last 30 years. Some of that decline is due to the rise in aggressive tax avoidance by corporations. So let's just look at one way to close these common unintended loopholes in state tax laws and return some of that revenue to things like K-12 education. The first solution we explore to combat aggressive corporate tax avoidance is adopting combined reporting. There are 22 states that stand to benefit from this tax policy change, and the write-up on the website lists which states those are, but you can see it on the map here. The states that do not yet have combined reporting are shown in dark blue and olive. Without going into all the details, essentially combined reporting requires large multi-state and multinational corporations to file a single unified tax report that includes all the profits and losses of all the various subsidiary companies that the parent company owns. This eliminates the tax advantages of artificially shifting profits and expenses among a corporation's subsidiaries. Instituting this change can result in a gain of tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars in new annual revenue, depending on the size of the state's economy. 23 states already require combined reporting, and 7 of these have adopted combined reporting in just the last decade. So your state could be next. But we were going to look at a couple of other options here, but I think we're just going to pass right through that in the interest of time and hear from Allie Mickelson of the Colorado Fiscal Institute. And welcome, Allie.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope so.
We absolutely can.
Okay, good. I'm always behind in the technology world. Thank you guys so much for having me today. We, as you can imagine, at the Colorado Fiscal Institute, we really love talking about taxes and budget and stuff like that. And so any chance I have to come and talk about this stuff is always so exciting. But one of the things I'm going to talk about is what we lovingly call the Dirty Dozen campaign, and I'll explain that. But one of the reasons that I think this is really important, it's a completely different strategy than what we heard about from California, because this was entirely targeted at the legislature. So our audience was the General Assembly and the governor. We got some outside media hits and things like that, but those really the general public was not who we were trying to influence with this campaign. But let's go to that first slide. Okay, thank you. So just like many states, in 2009 we were facing a $1.3 billion shortfall in our budget. And as all of you, I'm sure, recognize, a lot of that money tends to come out of K-12 education. And we also have a unique constitutional restraint on how we deal with revenue here in the state called TABOR, which could be a 2-hour webinar of its own. But it certainly doesn't put us in a better situation when it comes to making budget and revenue decisions. So in 2009, there was already a group together that was really starting to talk about some of our sort of revenue constraints. And so we had the advantage of already having a coalition together. And when we found out we were going to have a $1.3 billion shortfall again, we got together with this large coalition of advocates that included healthcare advocates, unions, education advocates, membership organizations, nerds like us. It was a really pretty broad coalition, and it was kind of a unique coalition because a lot of times when you have a budget shortfall, you've got a lot of individual advocacy groups fighting for their piece. But fortunately, we had a large coalition that understood we were kind of all in it together. And instead of saying, I'm going to go and fight for all the healthcare funding I could get, we decided to come at it from a different angle and try to see if we could raise some revenue to address this shortfall. So CFI kind of led the effort in putting together what we just called a list of revenue options. A large majority of these things were closing tax loopholes. Again, because of some of the restraints we have in our state, we can't do we don't have a lot of options in how we generate revenue, but one of the things we can do is make tax policy changes. And so that's where we went with this. We put together some revenue options, and we sent them to the governor, and we sent them to several legislators. We tried to get some good buy-in, and we were really pleased to see when our governor came out with his 2010 budget proposal for the General Assembly that several of these are included, at least in some form. Some were modified, and then some they had come up with on their own, but they were definitely on board with sort of recognizing the need for new revenue. And of course, there was 12 tax-related bills in total, which is where we got the loving name, the Dirty Dozen. And that kind of, I think if you Google Colorado Dirty Dozen, this little period of time where we were fighting to close these tax loopholes would come up. If we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So this was, once it was out with the governor's budget and these bills were decided to be carried by various legislatures, they began right out of the gate doing hearings on these credits. And it became kind of a division. It was this advocates versus business. We, as this coalition of advocates, we held rallies. We came together and provided a lot of testimony on the impact of budget cuts. So we found it was really, really important to have not only someone like me who can come in and talk about revenue impacts and maybe where we rank or our regressive tax system, but to have a teacher come in and say, I have to provide all of our school supplies, or to have people from healthcare community come in and say, we had to close a clinic. And so that was what we really found, and just I'm sure as any campaign really translated well with legislators, and I'm sure is the same with the general public. On the flip side, the business lobby came in and they would do the same testimony. They would call everything a job killer. Everything was a job killer, to the point that we made a joke that we were going to put job killer on our business cards, because that was really the bottom line for everything. And they would do, I remember we had a credit to add us or increase, put our sales tax to apply to candy and soda, which is something we've seen across the country that people do. And the Coca-Cola plant, the local Coca-Cola plant, brought all of their employees in and just packed this hearing room with sort of this notion of we're all the ones who are going to lose our jobs, which is also really effective. And so this became kind of a battle, and it really brought the budget trade-offs and kind of the priorities in budget to the forefront, and that really became the frame for all of our debates, which was a great outcome because people really did start to realize that without revenue, we can't fund things that we care about like education, and one way that we are losing revenue is through these various sort of tax loopholes that we haven't even looked at for 20 years. And of course, the media really loved this division, this kind of battle. And so if you go to the next slide, I didn't have any cool videos, so I just put together these are a sampling of media headlines from these are actually from mostly conservative websites, which you can probably tell by the titles here, but it was all about the Dirty Dozen and the job being killed, and it was very party line, it was very contentious, and it was it was a lot of drama, and it was something we saw played out in the media quite a bit. So then if we go to the next slide, and I'm going through this pretty quickly, but I'm happy to answer more questions. We did, as Kurt mentioned, we were successful in passing 9 of the 12 credits, and so that was pretty exciting, and that added between $150 and $170 million in revenue to the state, which was not up to the $1.3 billion, but made a huge, huge dent in that budget and that budget gap. And when we were kind of in the heart of the recession, that was really, really exciting and important. The other really great success that we have that we still take advantage of today is there was really a lot of dialogue created around understanding both the impact of budget priorities and special interest tax credits, and we still hear that today. We are in a different part of the cycle, as I'm sure a lot of you recognize, and we have growing revenues. And this year, our legislature, our General Assembly, was eager to give some of that money away for tax credits. And we heard a lot of our messages around that kind of developed out of the Dirty Dozen campaign repeated back to us, talking about the budget is about priorities, and if we pass this credit, then we're not funding this part of special education or whatever the case may be. So that was a really big kind of unintended success that we still get to enjoy today. So we go to the next slide. So these were kind of our big takeaways from the campaign itself. The first was to develop a broad coalition. I mean, the first two are the same as what Stephen said, and I think that they might just be the basis for any sort of revenue options or revenue campaign. But we had a really great broad coalition, as I mentioned before, with a lot of different members. But beyond that, this group had previously worked on a revenue measure that was on the ballot, so they really got the issue. They really understood how the budget looked, what these tax credits meant for the budget, and they really understood where their role was and how we could kind of all get together and kind of how a rising tide raises all ships. And we don't always have that, I think, in the coalitions. We get some people who are there understandably kind of supporting their own interest, especially when you have such a broad group, and this group really understood what we were all there for. And they also showed up. I don't know about other states, but we do a lot of legislative work or campaigns or things like that, and you can even have a broad coalition, but it's hard to just turn people out. And one of the great things that happened at the Dirty Dozen time was that everybody came and they were willing to show up, to share their story, to contact legislators. It was very collaborative, and that was really important. And just as Stephen said, the timing really is everything. We had a recession, which was we probably didn't have the widespread recognition of the budget issues, especially since this was a very legislative issue, and so we didn't quite have that public understanding, but the recession was happening, so people were starting to feel that pinch, and they knew what that looked like in their pocketbooks, and so I think they could relate to what the state was going through. They were also starting to feel the impact of cuts in the programs that they care about. I mean, going back to school supplies, I'm sure you all know, but we always have, that's the big fight here, and we see a lot of people that have to provide more and more of their children's school supplies and all of these things. So people were starting to recognize that the recession was hitting and the times were getting tight. We also had a governor that was willing to put out revenue options to address the need for revenue, which was very unique, actually. And we had a General Assembly that was made up with so that they would pass it. And that was, I don't want to say luck, that was sort of serendipitous in a way. But I think one of the things that's important to talk about, taking advantage of timing is everything, is sometimes we hit these times and we sort of say, oh, well, it's a recession, this is a really hard time to go in and fight about revenue or things like that. We kind of shy away from taking advantage of that moment, and we really took advantage of sort of this downturn and everything that was going on, and I don't want to say that in a negative way, but it really helped our messaging. And then the final thing that might sound kind of simple is just to do something. We were lucky enough to pass 9 of the credits and create some revenue for the state, but even if we hadn't, we started that conversation. Everybody started to recognize, as I said before, the budget is about priorities, the role that tax credits play, the role that business special interests play. And the other thing is that we planted the seed. So say if we only passed 9 of these, maybe those other 3 were something that legislators had in their mind for the following year. And we've seen that happen a lot. Once we kind of plant that seed and we start the conversation, then we have future success, especially with revenue stuff, because it can be so complicated. So I think that's all that I have, and I'm aware that I talk really quickly, so please ask me to repeat things or whatever questions you have.
Great. Thank you very much. Allie's an inspiring story and one with a lot of useful takeaways. We should just remind folks that the Colorado Fiscal Institute is another one of these SFAI and EARN network groups, so just another example of the great work they do. Jocelyn, it sounds like we have one question.
Yeah, we've got one question from Howard here that I think he's asking specifically about California, but I think can be true in a lot of discussions around raising revenue to support education. So Howard's asking, did the Prop 30 taxes slow the California economy, as a lot of people generally tend to think that taxes will? Kurt, I think you can probably talk to how the correlations between state spending on education can generally be a better indicator of economic health in the state instead of the general tax levels.
Yeah, absolutely. As we covered in the last webinar, there's a great deal of research that shows that tax levels do not have substantial impacts on state economies within, fairly reasonable ranges. I don't know the specifics of the California situation. Stephen, do you know more about that?
Only that we often point to some of the same research that you would cite, which is to show that if you look, that we don't see any connection between tax rates here and patterns of economic growth. In fact, if anything, one thing I can say is that if you look at the corporate tax rate, for example, that actually has continued to sort of trend down, or I should say, it continued to trend down a period during the last 20 to 25 years, really reducing the rate, the income tax rate on businesses, and that trend downward ran across, a couple full up and down cycles in the economy. So you don't see any sort of correlation between tax rates in that respect and economic strength. It is an argument, as you would imagine, that we hear all the time, that taxes are a drag on the economy, or that it's going to drive some of the higher income people out of the state. But in fact, as the research that Kurt alludes to always points out, it's really, what drives a strong economy and creates jobs is investing in things like, K-12 education, colleges and universities, strong transportation and communication networks, and things like that that actually provide the foundation for good jobs. So, but we haven't seen a connection between tax rates and economic performance.
And the only thing I would add to that, because I think just to reinforce for people, we didn't go over this again today, but in the introduction section on the website, there's some really good information to help you make these arguments that, sort of amplify what Kurt and Steve are talking about.
Absolutely. That's a good reminder, Ann. Well, I think we've run up hard against the end of our time here. Thank you so much, Ali and Stephen, for providing us with the insights into the campaigns that you ran. All of you should be encouraged to explore the OTL website a little more. I'm going to thank you for your time and sign off and hand it back over to Ann. Thank you.
Great. It really, just thank you for everyone. And one reminder, I know Jocelyn put it there on the chat thing, if you have questions that don't get answered as you go through the website, send them to info, just email info@otlscampaign.org, and we can, be kind of a switching station there and help you get answers or get you referred to something who might be helpful to you. But thank you very much to everyone. We really appreciate it and hope that we can be helpful as you move forward. Signing off.
Thanks, everyone.